Hello once again and welcome to Oxfam and Human Rights and Business Academy's second webinar of our week-long virtual course on business and human rights. My name is Sri Radhakrishnan. I work with Oxfam India and I'm delighted that we are able to do this despite the unprecedented and uncertain times that we are in due to COVID-19, which in a way forced us to go virtual. Also means that we are able to get more and more people, reach out to more people who are interested in this BHR course. At the moment, we are at 251 attendees, which is the maximum capacity for this platform. And if you are unable to join this, or if you know others who are unable to join the webinar, please direct them to Responsible Biz Facebook page where you can attend the Facebook live session. Today's topic is the correlation between SDGs and BHR. And for that, we have SURYA, professor at the City University in Hong Kong, as well as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. This is a topic that is very close to my heart. I've been working on SDGs for the past 5 years, and this year happens to also be the decade of action for SDGs. We are 10 years to go on SDGs, 2020 to 2030. And the first 5 years have given us a flavor of how SDGs have progressed and the challenges that there are, that we need to overcome. So this is a really opportune moment to tackle a topic as important as SDGs and BHR, where for the first time, business as a stakeholder is a very central part of the Agenda 2030. With that short introduction, and without taking any more time away from this seminar and what Surya has to talk about, I hand the floor over to Surya. Thanks.
Thank you, Tree. And because you have so much interest in this theme, so stay connected. So we could have a dynamic dialogue as well, and probably you could pick up some questions as well and assist me in that. So I would welcome you if you're free to continue with us. So hello everyone. So I hope some of you or many of you attended the first webinar as well. So this webinar is primarily going to focus on two aspects. First aspect is I would like to explain in more detail what UN guiding principles are, what are the three pillars of the UN guiding principles, and what our states and businesses are expected to do. Then I will also explain very briefly Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and then try to make a connection between the two, because this connection between the two is going to be a real game changer in my view in the next 10 years or so. And if we don't get it right, then perhaps the progress will not be adequate. I will again try to take some questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the questions tab, or any comments or any disagreements. If you have any views that you don't share with me, that's fine. So we would like to make it interactive and dynamic. So with that brief context, let me start with the quick introduction. I see some questions about some of you joined on Facebook Live. That is great. And for the purpose of getting a certificate, I don't think there is any issue. Oxfam team will take care of it, and your participation will be counted. So let us start with the brief historical context. So these UN guiding principles, and now they're mostly known as UNGPs, they were adopted by the UN Human Rights Council in June 2011. And these are the global standards in the field of business and human rights. They're not legally binding, but they're highly influential. And I will give you concrete examples how they are changing the legal and policy landscape all over the world, including in Asia. They were developed by Professor John Ruggie. Again, you see the picture here on the slide during 3-year process, 2005 to 2011. And the process was very consultative, meaning thereby there were consultations with the states, businesses, civil society, trade unions all over the world. And that's why the legitimacy of this instrument is quite relevant through those consultations. Now, what are the key aspects of the UN guiding principles? I think they apply to all business enterprises. That is a very important starting point. They're not applicable only to TNCs. They're not only applicable to companies operating in a particular sector. Rather, they apply to each and every company, even partnership firm, in a law firm. And I think even organizations like FIFA is a non-governmental organization which regulates football, for instance. Even FIFA and Olympic Association, they are respecting UN guiding principles, even if they are not technically speaking business entities. So they are really covering almost everyone. Then they apply to all human rights. So we use human rights here in a broad sense to cover all labor rights, all human rights, all environmental rights, and climate change issues, I think, should also be included. That is something we need to consider. I already see a question, does it apply to NGOs? And the answer is technically no, but in practice, yes. So I hope that answered that question. Now, there are 31 principles, and you will get all these slides, so no need to copy the slides. And these 31 principles, if you have not read them, you will be able to see the link to a soft copy at the end of these PowerPoints, so you will be able to get it. They have 3 pillars, the guiding principles: pillar 1, pillar 2, pillar 3. Pillar 1, as you see here, is the state duty to protect human rights. There are 10 principles here, 1 to 10. The second is business responsibility to respect human rights. And here we have 14 principles, 11 to 24. And the third one has 7 principles, 25 to 31. All right. Now, what you will notice is that the state duty, the pillar 1, is in a way legally binding, because this pillar 1 is merely outlining, elaborating the obligations of states to protect human rights. On the other hand, pillar 2 is not legally binding, because here the focus is on responsibility to respect human rights. And pillar 3 is access to remedy. And here the responsibility or the obligation is both of the governments as well as private sector to provide remedies if there are violations, right? Now, what you will notice here is that there is a distinction between protect and respect, right? I hope you understand the human rights typology, which is tripartite: respecting human rights, protecting human rights, and fulfilling human rights. So what you notice here is that respecting is considered more like a negative responsibility. So businesses should not violate human rights, should not infringe human rights. But UN guiding principles don't really expect businesses to protect or fulfill human rights. On the other hand, when it comes to state duty to protect, I think that is very vital, because that duty means that all the companies operating from or within a particular state, the government has an obligation to ensure that they don't abuse human rights. So I think that is the brief introduction to these 3 principles. I already mentioned 3 pillars, sorry. I already mentioned to you that UN guiding principles in itself are not legally binding, but they are highly influential because, first of all, they're based on binding international human rights law. At the same time, they are influencing the policies and the legal framework in many countries. And this slide gives you an example of it. So, for instance, you see here the modern slavery legislation in UK and Australia. You see the due diligence legislation in France. In Asia, you see the regulation in the fishing sector in Indonesia. You see the guidelines which were adopted last year in India, national guidelines on responsible business conduct, again influenced by UN guiding principles. And you see in the Netherlands, the Dutch Child Labor Due Diligence Act. And many other countries, as we speak, like Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Norway. So many countries in Europe are considering to enact a law to implement the UN guiding principles. And in fact, there is a process, at least a commitment made at the political level in the European Union, that they may introduce a regulation in 2021 for the entire European Union. As I mentioned during the first webinar, that even if this regulation is going to apply to companies operating in or from European Union, this will have implications for companies from Asia as well. And that's why companies in Asia, especially the big ones, especially those who are part of the supply chain of the European companies, they should start getting ready now, because this is happening. This will happen definitely. It's a matter of time when it will happen and what will be the nature of these regulations coming out of European Union. Now, in the same year, 2021, a UN working group was established, and this working group has 5 members. I am one of those members representing Asia Pacific, and we have the mandate to disseminate and implement UN guiding principles. And in a way, this course is part of our mandate, because if people do not know what the UN guiding principles are, they cannot really follow and implement them. Now, for the governments, we recommend the governments to adopt a national action plan on business and human rights. We have provided a guidance document on that. And in Asia, the Thailand government has already adopted a national action plan, and the government in India, in Pakistan, and in Japan, in South Korea, in Mongolia, Indonesia, Malaysia are doing some national action plans on business and human rights. Countries like Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Myanmar, they're also trying to do something. So it's yet to be seen how this will work. All right. So that was the context of the guidelines. Now I would like to go to the 3 pillars one by one and explain some key issues. How do we deal with those particular issues? Now I start with pillar 1, and as I mentioned to you, pillar 1 is aiming at states. I will not be able to go into each of these 10 principles, but I will highlight some key issues from those principles. Let us take principle 1. Now, principle 1 is basically telling the governments that they must take appropriate steps to prevent violations by corporations, by businesses, which are operating within their territory or jurisdiction. Now, you see there are 2 words, territory and jurisdiction. And I would like to explain a bit the distinction between the 2. Is there anyone who understands the distinction between the 2? You can use your question function and tell me if you understand the distinction between territory and jurisdiction of a country. Yes, Akshay is saying yes, but can you explain? Territory is geography, yes, very good. So territory is referring to the physical territory of a particular country. But the concept of jurisdiction is very wide. So the Indian government can exercise jurisdiction over any Indian citizen anywhere in the world, right? And I think that is the context within which the Indian government has requested, for instance, that some people who have fled India, like if I mention Kingfisher, you know who I'm talking about. So the Indian government is trying to get that person back. So that is because the person is not within the territory of India, but the government has jurisdiction over it, right? So the key issue here is that the responsibility of, in fact, I should say the duty of the government in India is not merely to ensure that the Indian companies operating in India respect human rights. They also have an obligation that when Indian companies are operating in the Gulf, in Africa, or elsewhere in Asia, they respect human rights as well. And same applies to, let us say, a French company operating in Bangladesh. So if you have a French company operating in Bangladesh, so here you have Bangladesh government having territory, and they should ensure that the company does not violate human rights. But the French government also has an obligation to ensure that the French company operating in Bangladesh does not violate human rights. So I think that is the significance of principle 1. Now, principle 2 is about extraterritorial obligations, which are obligations beyond one's territory. And that is where this issue of supply chains become relevant, because the expectation is that the businesses should respect human rights throughout their operations. So it is not enough for a company to say that we are respecting human rights in our core business. Rather, you have to respect human rights throughout your operations. And again, the supply chains, as I was giving example in the first webinar, could be very complex. They could be multi-tiered, but the responsibility does not stop at tier 1. Rather, they have to keep on ensuring that their suppliers in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 respect human rights. Now, let me, if you don't mind, I will, I have a second screen, so I will look at this side and try to look at some of the questions. And if I could address one or two questions before I move on. Yes, the recording and the PowerPoints will be shared, so don't worry about that. Jurisdiction comes into question, especially in the context of special economic zones. Yes, so special economic zones are also part of the physical territory of a particular country. So when the governments are establishing special economic zones or export processing zones, the governments have a obligation to ensure that human rights, labor rights, and the environmental issues are not ignored, because it is part of their obligation. So there is no sequencing here. I'll give an example of Make in India. Make in India is an initiative to attract more and more investment, right? So that is a good idea. But at the same time, the government cannot think that let us first attract the investment and we talk about human rights and labor rights or environmental pollution at the later stage. No, you have to integrate this as part of your Make in India initiative. There's a question from someone, DEVA, I think, that is there a difference between principle 1 and 2? Yes, there's a difference. So I would encourage you to read the language of these two principles and you will get what I mean. So A is the principle 1 is the foundational principle. Principle 2 focuses mostly on the extraterritorial dimensions of it. So I think that is the key difference you will notice. There is a question about migrant workers, right? This is a question from Anuprita. The question is, how would it help migrant workers who have migrated from India to different countries? Let us take a concrete example. So if the workers from South Asia have gone to Gulf countries and because of COVID, the factories are closed. So the question is, who has the obligation to help these workers? The answer is, Indian government has an obligation to ensure that these people come back. The government of that country also has an obligation, and they should work together to ensure it. At the same time, the companies also have an obligation. The company which may have sent these workers to Gulf countries and the company where they were working, they also have a responsibility to take care of those workers and potentially contribute to their return by providing funding also some cases, because ultimately companies make tons of money through these workers. And then if there's a difficult time, then the governments as well as businesses should be willing to help those workers, migrant workers, who may not have the capacity. All right, so let us move on. I will take some more questions later on, but I also want to try to cover as many principles as possible. So you have then principle 4. Principle 4 is relevant in the context of state-owned enterprises. So those are the state-owned enterprises, which in Indian context, you call them public sector undertakings, PSUs. You have some examples here, and I'm sure there are participants from different Asian countries, and you can relate to similar companies in your countries. So principle 4 is saying that whenever you have a public sector company or a state-owned enterprise, it has a higher responsibility to respect human rights, because in a way it is part of the government, it is part of the state. And if you look at Indian constitutional law, at least some public sector enterprises, you can even seek fundamental rights against them because of the state instrumentality principle, right? So we have to see this in the context of that as well. So additional steps should be taken, and the companies should take more precautions, especially if they're operating abroad. So let us say if an Indian company, ONGC, has a project in Africa. So then this company, as well as the Indian government, has to ensure that there is no unnecessary environmental pollution in that African country. That is part of the government responsibility. That is also part of the responsibility of ONGC. Principle 5 is again quite critical. because increasingly you will see that the government is withdrawing from public services. Rather, the private sector is providing all the services. So whether it is health or education or security, or even at the airport, you will see there are a lot of private security officers which are helping there, or there are security guards of private companies, right? Even the Aadhaar in India or elsewhere, so even passports, who is printing passports? It's a private company printing it for the Indian government, right? Or any government for that matter. If you want to apply for a visa, again, you will see there are centers where the governments have outsourced the visa application process. So these are the private companies, or they could be public-private partnerships. We call it triple P. So all these situations are relevant for Principle 5. And here the obligation of the government is that when you privatize, that is fine if you want to do it, but you must integrate human rights as part of that contracting process. And again, this is the obligation that the governments have. And I think that is where the court action could be relevant. So if the governments are not following Principle 5, I think it could open a door, in my view, in future for taking the government to the court, that you have these soft obligations. And if you combine those soft obligations with your constitutional obligations, or your obligations under international treaties that the countries have ratified, then if you combine all this together, then you have to ensure that these private companies do not violate human rights when they are performing those basic services. And now trade and investment is again a key issue, and all the countries would like to attract investment. But here again, what you will notice is that Principle 9 is talking about a situation that these agreements that you're trying to attract more and more investment should not discourage or diminish the protection of human rights. Now let us take a concrete example. Now because of COVID, now the governments are asking many private hospitals that, okay, you have to give so many of your wards for COVID patients. Now these private hospitals could be also from foreign investors. So it is possible that some of these foreign investors may file a case against the Indian government later that, okay, how come you are compelling us to not make money? Rather, you are compelling us to admit COVID patients. You are also putting a cap on how much we can charge. And because of this, our profit is less, and that violates these investment agreement or a trade agreement. And I think that is where the policy space becomes relevant. I'm sure you're following the India-China conflict and the Indian government banning certain apps or excluding Chinese companies. That will again raise issues about trade agreements. So if there are trade agreements, so China can potentially bring Indian government to the court or before arbitration, and then the Indian government would have to justify whether their restrictions are legitimate and whether they are serving any legitimate purpose. And that is where the drafting of these agreements become crucial. So when you are negotiating these agreements, the government should include exceptions that we can restrict these agreements and contracts in the public interest for human rights, to protect the environment, or national security, if that is a legitimate consideration. So these are some of the principles from Pillar 1, which I wanted to touch upon. And I would again turn to some of the questions that I see on the questions tab. Okay, so there's a question from Ishita that can there be an institution to safeguard government employees as well to bring down the corruption? Yes. So we call it whistleblowing legislation. So the governments, as part of this, because civil society actors and whistleblowers have a key role to play, so the government should enact legislation and protect whistleblowers if there is a corruption. And corruption can undermine human rights, and that's why it is better to have a non-corruption environment and governance. So I think that is definitely quite relevant.
Sorry, Surya, just to interrupt a bit. So these questions that Ishita is posting are basically by our participants from the Facebook live session. So these are, say, Akanksha
Oh, I see.
Tiwari and Prerna Kaushik. They are typing these
Now I
questions.
see. Now I see. Thank you for pointing that. So the questions are posted by Ishita, but they are from Prerna. So my
Yes.
apologies for that. So Prerna, that was one of your questions. There was a question from Anju says, though India might have agreed to develop a NAP on BHR, at the same time it is in the process of diluting protection of labor rights. How do you ensure uniform policy? Very good question. So I think that is where the real policy coherence comes into picture. Merely saying it, that we would like to develop a national action plan, is not enough. And I think the difficulty with Indian government and many other governments in Asia are that they are making a political commitment which is not deep rooted. Deep rooted means, let us say in India, Ministry of Corporate Affairs is taking the lead. But what about the Ministry of Labor? What about Ministry of Environment? What about Ministry of Climate Justice? What about Ministry of Child and Women Welfare? So it is quite critical that all the relevant departments and ministries of the government, Niti Aayog as well, and the National Human Rights Commission as well, they come together and they discuss that this is where the country would like to go. Same applies to Pakistan, same applies to Bangladesh, same applies to any country. So I'm just giving this as an example. So policy coherence is that all the departments and ministries of the government come together and agree. So if you are starting a project on national highway, then integrate labor rights, human rights, environmental protection in that project as well. How will it promote human rights? Because we have right to travel. So a highway will promote human rights, but a highway may also damage some human rights. Trees may have to be cut, some people's land may be taken away, their livelihood is impacted. The workers who are working on developing this highway, how much wages they are getting, So these are the considerations the government have to take into account in a holistic manner. I think that is the crux of the matter here. There's also a question from Pawan Kumar Arora. So the question is, by charging excess money and threatening patients from fake illness by doctors is not a violation of human rights? Absolutely. Private sector run health clinics is a big issue. And that is where the government has to come up with better regulation, the Indian government or any government for that matter. If you allow private companies to run schools, if you allow private companies to run universities, if you allow private companies to provide security, if you allow private companies to run clinics and hospitals, you must ensure and regulate them effectively. Otherwise, as we see it, private companies are considering health as a business. Once you go to a clinic, they don't let you go anywhere. Even if the person is dead, I've seen some cases, patient has died or about to die, and they will pretend, oh, buy this medicine, do this treatment, and they will keep on adding the bill. This is definitely a clear violation of human rights. So here, in addition to what the government should do, even that hospital has a responsibility. And I think that is what we need to highlight. We need to become more aware and put pressure on these companies as well. Take them to the consumer courts, take them to the national human rights institutions for seeking some remedies. Send a complaint outside as well. If there is a company which is from Europe, send a complaint to the OECD national contact points or United Nations. So I think there are a number of ways how this can be done. So after taking some of these questions, I would like to move to pillar 2 now. Now, pillar 2 is about businesses having a responsibility to respect human rights. Now, what is crucial is that this responsibility is independent of what the governments are doing. So what the governments are doing is not relevant for a company because companies have an independent responsibility. So let us say, for the sake of argument, if the government of a particular country is ignoring human rights, it doesn't matter. Let us say I live in China, in Hong Kong, right? So let us say government of China is ignoring human rights. It does not matter. The companies operating in mainland China, they should try their best to respect human rights. And that applies to any company operating anywhere. Same applies to India. Someone was asking a question during webinar 1 Oh, some governments in India are relaxing labor laws. It does not mean anything. Even if the government is relaxing the labor laws, you as a company should still follow labor laws. That is what is your pillar 2 responsibility. Of course, I'm not defending what the government is doing. The government, what it has done is wrong. It is in breach of pillar 1. But even if the government is breaching pillar 1, the private sector has an independent responsibility. Now, you see this phrase here, internationally recognized human rights. This is defined by Principle 12, and basically it means UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as ICCPR, including all civil and political rights, as well as ICSCR, all economic, social, and cultural rights are included, as well as it includes the fundamental principles of the ILO. And that's why labor rights, human rights, environmental rights, all are covered. If you look at the commentary of Principle 12, you will notice that additional standards may also become relevant, which basically means that if you're dealing with children, the Convention on the Rights of the Child will become relevant. If you're dealing with women, and there are women all, everywhere, whether they are part of the workforce or they are part of the community, so if you want to respect the rights of the women and achieve gender equality, then CEDAW will become relevant. If you're dealing with rights of LGBTI community, then there are separate standards that you should follow. If you're dealing with climate change, then there are separate standards you should follow. So the list is minimum, but basically everything is to be considered by companies in a holistic manner. Now, what does it mean? It basically means that you will see that it is a do no harm responsibility, that primarily the businesses are expected to respect human rights, which basically means do not violate human rights, do not infringe human rights. So we do not really expect businesses to protect human rights or fulfill human rights. Let us take a case that if in future a company is able to develop a vaccine for COVID. Now the question is whether this company should provide this vaccine to everyone in the world for free. Should it provide at a reasonable price, which is affordable price, or should it start charging anything it wants? And I think that is where the UN guiding principles will become relevant. Even if business, a particular company has developed this vaccine, it cannot start charging any amount it wants, because if it starts doing so, it will have a negative impact on right to life, right to health. And I think that is where this not do no harm will become relevant. Of course, we do not expect this company to provide vaccine for free, because that could be the job of the government to provide that vaccine for free for poor people, right? The second element of this responsibility is to address adverse impact. You try to not violate any human rights, do no harm as we call it. But if you end up causing any adverse impact, then you should try to address it. And that is where the aspect of remedy becomes relevant. Businesses are expected to provide remedies, and I will talk about that a little later. I think that could be a time to ask one poll question to you. And so Oxfam team, if you can flash the question and participants can join in, I will try to answer some of the questions in the meantime.
Sure.
All right, so there's a question from Akshay. How can responsibility on businesses to respect human rights be turned into a liability in law? Okay. Akshay, that is already happening. So if you remember in the morning also, not morning, but in webinar 1, I talked about with Justine about mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. So those legislation are turning this responsibility into legal binding, because there is a dynamic relationship between pillar 1 and pillar 2. So pillar 1 is legally binding on the government. So to discharge pillar 1 obligation, companies have to the governments have to ensure that the businesses do human rights due diligence. So pillar 1 has the potential to make pillar 2 legally binding, but you have to enact a law to do that. All right, so then there's a question from Shomya. Shomya question is, do you think a slow justice system increases the problem of human rights violation? Absolutely. So if there is, let me answer this question and then we'll look at the poll result as well. If you look at the lack of accountability, because companies are not held to accountable even if they violate human rights, and that creates a sense of impunity. That means that companies can do whatever they want, and I think that is highly problematic. And I think in that particular sense, it is critical that basically businesses are held to account for their violations, and that will promote their respect for human rights. Now let us look at the poll results. So poll results, the question was that should businesses have a responsibility beyond respecting human rights? And I'm quite surprised by the result because 86% of you are saying yes. Of course, companies do not want to say this, that they have a responsibility beyond respecting, but I personally agree with the majority opinion in this survey, because I think UN guiding principles are merely setting a floor, the bottom floor, and I think that is not enough. We need companies to go beyond respecting human rights, and in some situations, they should have the responsibility to protect human rights as well as fulfill human rights. But of course, their responsibility cannot be the same as the responsibility of the government. All right, so that is it about the poll question, and I would like to now continue with the PowerPoint, and hopefully this works. I think I have the same issue that I can't. So bear with me. I will try to turn off this and start the PowerPoint again so that I can do it in the slide mode. So please bear with me for a second. And if it does not work, then at least can you see the slides now? But it seems the slideshow is somehow not working.
No, Surya, we can't see your slides. Can you do the screen share again?
I'm doing it now.
Yes, I can see it.
And it seems the slideshow is also working, right?
Yes.
All right, so I think I would like to now explain a lot of questions coming, but I will go to tell a bit more about UN Working Group. I can do that. Or probably I will do that now before I forget. So UN Working Group are 5 independent experts. We are not UN employees. So like I'm a professor here, I don't get paid by the UN, so I do this as part of my pro bono work, and there are 4 other experts coming from different parts of the world. And we work with the government. So I talk to the government officials in different countries. I talk to companies. I talk to CSOs. I'm talking to all of you. So our role is to build capacity, give advice to governments, companies, and civil society what they should do. That's how we try to disseminate and implement the UN guiding principles. We also have the power to accept complaints. So if someone wants to look at this, probably I can share later through email or through this chat box the link where you will find more information about the complaint system. So that is in brief about the UN Working Group. We also organize a number of events in different parts of the world. And again, you're most than welcome to join those events. And again, the information is available on our website. So I would like to go back to Principle 13. Principle 13 is very vital because it talks about the range of situations in which businesses have a responsibility. And again, you will see there are 3 situations: cause, contribute, and directly linked. And I will try to explain to this you in a second. So hopefully you can see the slide. So causing is where company is directly causing an adverse impact on human rights. Let us say a company is there and this company fires a woman from their office simply because this woman got pregnant, and they think, oh, why to give pregnancy benefit to this woman, and that's why they find an excuse and fire this woman. Now this is causing adverse impact, so very serious. Or if you have a factory and the pollutants from that factory are flowing directly into the river or a lake, that is again a very classical example of company causing adverse impact. Second situation is contributing. Now, contributing is that you are partly causing it, but there could be other actors who are contributing to it as well. So here it could be a situation of you are providing some aid and assistance. So this could be a situation of complicity. So it could be a situation like 3 companies together are causing an adverse impact. Let us say one company created an app and the second company posted that app on its Google platform. So here Google did not create the app, but some other company created the app. But if the Google is letting its platform for that app downloading, and that app is, let us say, breaching your privacy, then Google as well as that company both are contributing to the adverse impact. Or if a bank provides a loan to a company, and that company invests into a power project or some factory, and that factory violates human rights, so the bank has a responsibility in those situations. The third scenario is what is most critical for supply chains, because that is where the direct linkage becomes relevant. So you have, let us say, Samsung, Philips, or any company, let us say Tata as a big company, or any company for that matter. Now they have their supply chains all over the world. So let us say you buy clothes from Marks and Spencer. Now, how do you buy clothes? How do they manufacture clothes? You need cotton. So they are sourcing cotton from some farmers. So if there is child labor in the cotton farms, then Marks and Spencer selling t-shirts should be responsible for that. That is the whole idea of this. So if you have, let's say, Nestle selling chocolates, the question is, do you need sugar to make chocolates? Yes. From where the sugar cane is coming? Because sugar cane is needed, or something else is needed to make sugar. And what are the conditions there about labor rights or the environment? So Nestle has a responsibility in those situations, supply chain situations. Crucial thing is direct linkage should be there with your products or services that you're providing. Now, what should you do? The guiding principles provide you what you should do. So this is most serious, so you should stop that action. This is least serious, but again, you have a responsibility in those situations. And what is crucial is the concept of leverage. So companies, as well as the governments, and even we as consumers and investors, we have a leverage. We can influence the decision-making process of others. So we should use that leverage in a positive way. So if there is a big company and it has supply chain in Bangladesh because of COVID situation, so these workers are poor workers in Bangladesh. So the lead company selling these garments or shoes in the Europe or US or in Canada, it has a responsibility to ensure that those people in Bangladesh are not fired. At least you can send them on unpaid leave or provide them some food for some time, because you need these workers again when situation is normal, right? So I think that is the leverage that that brand company should use in those particular situations. So I will continue with this and I will turn to questions, little bit more questions. I see a lot of questions. Probably we need more time to capture these questions. But let us say how much I can cover, because I also want to explain some of these principles. So I will also explain what should businesses do. There are 3 things companies should do. First, they should make a policy commitment. So look at the website of any company you know. And if they do not have a policy commitment to respect human rights, you should ask them to do that. As a consumer, as an investor, as an employee, you can ask them that, look, there is a principle which expects you to do this. Second thing is human rights due diligence, HRDD as we call it. And I will explain this in a little bit more detail because that is the tool to respect human rights. And the third is remediation. They should provide remedies if there are some abuses. So these are three things each and every company should do. Before I explain due diligence, I would again turn to some of the questions that I see here. Let me see what I have. Again, so many questions. My apologies, I cannot. So there's a question from Harsha. Is Nestle completely unaware of the child labor? Still, it can be held liable? Yes. So what is happening is that Nestle is not completely unaware. It is doing some due diligence, and because of that, it knows it. Where are the difficulties? Sometimes it cannot fix those difficulties, but it is being held accountable because of these mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. So in France, in UK, cases are being filed. In Canada, the cases are being filed against these parent companies that if you do not respect human rights in the supply chain, you may have the responsibility. So I think that landscape is changing quite fast. So there is a question from Facebook, I think. The question is from Urmil Shah. The UN does not talk about the data production as from a human rights abuse. Can it be considered by companies like Zoom not respect privacy? Yes. UN guiding principles do not mention any specific rights, but they mention all human rights. So right to privacy is very much included. So don't think it is not included. So that is a very simple answer, because all the human rights which are under the international human rights law, everything is very much included. All right, let me take one more question. Aishwarya has a question that isn't the idea of companies going beyond their duty to implement UN human rights utopian? Yes, I mean, that is what you can argue, that they should not go beyond respecting human rights. They should not violate human rights. But let us, Ashwarya, let us look of a hypothetical situation. Let us say a company has a monopoly, and only that company has a particular app which can be used by the government. So I think that is a monopoly situation in which the company should have more than a responsibility to respect human rights. So let us talk about a mining company which has a license to do mining in a remote part of any country. And in that remote part, there are no hospitals, there are no roads, there are no schools, nothing. So what this mining company does, it builds a hospital only for its employees. But the people living in the nearby village have no hospital. So if someone gets seriously sick in that village, should this government, should this company say that this hospital is only for employees, not for these people in the village, and we have no responsibility to provide you health? Technically, legally speaking, yes. But morally speaking, ethically speaking, this company should help in those situations. And I think that is where this going beyond respecting human rights becomes quite crucial. I would like to turn back to the slides again because I'm conscious of time. And so what is due diligence and what is human rights due diligence? Now, if we were in a face-to-face class, I would have asked you this question: what due diligence you have done today? And my question to you again is this. So if you can use your question box to post something, have you done any due diligence? Forget about HRDD. I'm just asking, have you done any due diligence today on the 6th of June? If yes, give me an example. Vaishali, you say yes, give me an example. Or anyone else, give me an example of due diligence that you have done. Namta says no due diligence done. Okay. Before buying vegetables, we check it's rotten or not. Excellent. That is what due diligence is, right? So when you go to a supermarket to buy something, or when you go out, you check the weather forecast, right? Whether it's rain, too hot, too cold. That is what due diligence is, right? So due diligence is we do all the time, and companies also do it all the time. But normally we do it and companies do it to protect their own interest. So if you want to invest in a particular company, you will do due diligence and check the share price and see whether this company is good, reliable or not before you invest. Now here, due diligence is to protect your interest. But a key difference is that human rights due diligence is to protect the interest of others, not your interest. And I think that is a key point of difference. Now, how do you do it? Due diligence, there will be a separate webinar on mandatory due diligence, but I will introduce to you today the basic idea. The basic idea is this is an ongoing process, so you don't do it only once. A company should do it regularly. Regularly does not mean every day, every hour. It will depend upon the kind of business operations you have. And you should do it regularly, these 4 things, depending upon how big the company is, how major your operations are, and so on and so forth. So how do you start? You start by assessing the impact. What is the impact of your operations? Let us say a company finds that our factories in the supply chains, they're child labor. We have women workers, but women are not the managers. That is the second finding you have. The third finding could be that our factory is polluting too much. There's a lot of pollution, air pollution, noise pollution, or the pollutants going to the river or a lake or the ocean, whatever it is. Then you need to integrate those findings into your decisions. What can you change, right? So that I think will be the crucial thing. So if you find there is sexual harassment, then you need to see what can you change. Can you do the training for your employees? Can you appoint more women as the managers? Can you establish a complaint mechanism which is effective to ensure that there is no harassment going on, whether of male or female, or there is no harassment of LGBTI community, whether they are part of your employees or they're part of the community, if that is relevant, Then the third stage is tracking responses. How do you track response? Tracking responses that you cannot achieve all these things overnight. Some of the human rights goals can be very ambitious. Let us say you have only 5% managers who are women. Now you would like to achieve gender equality. You cannot achieve it overnight or next month. Then you can set targets that by 2021, we would like to have 10% women as managers. 2025, we want to have 25% women as managers. If you have gender pay gap, you can try to fix it. If you need to provide some benefits to the workers, let us say you need to provide them lunch break or sanitation issues, you cannot fix everything, but you can have those indicators and benchmarks and try to achieve it every month, every 6 months, every year. And the last step is you communicate what you have done. If there's some imperfection, share it. And also tell what else you would like to do in future. I think this process is quite dynamic process. And I think because of this dynamic process, things can change and businesses can start integrating human rights as part of their culture. And I think that is a key difference between CSR and BHR, because BHR would like to make human rights integral to your part. But CSR is ad hoc approach where companies can do whatever they want, how much money they want to spend, where they decide it. But business and human rights, or under HRDD, it is absolutely based on human rights, and demand is made by the rights holders that we demand this company and this government to do ABC. And I think that is a key difference between these processes. So there's a question. Let me go to some questions. So there's a question from Prashant Prabhu about, okay, are not having any limitations for working hours. They will work employees like 14 to 18 hours, 16 hours, especially trainees. Yes, this will violate labor laws. So if you have these workers and they're working for these long hours, that will definitely breach labor rights. And this company should not do it. And you should make a complaint about these particular situations. Then there is a question from All right, Mrityunjay question is defer purchases that may not be needed during such troubled times. Yes, so sometimes you can take dynamic steps, right? Dynamic steps could be that we do not have the demand for, let us say, shoes or clothes or anything you are making, but there are still factory workers who are making it. So what can you do? Either you can send them on unpaid leave or partial leave rather than firing them. Firing or laying off workers should be the last option, because when the factories come to life, you don't want to hire again untrained people. That will require a lot of investment of time. Then if you do not lay off a worker in a difficult time, that worker is going to be so much loyal and committed to this company. So you should see this, there's kind of this economic advantage which is hidden, and the companies have to understand this dynamic relationship. So I think that issue is quite relevant. There's a question from some Chaturvedi that is businesses are not legally bound to follow human rights. I think that's what you mean. In the working structure, will it not become more difficult for the law to protect the rights? I don't fully understand what your question is. I'm not clearly getting it. But basically what we are trying to say is that we need a combination of legal measures as well as soft standards like UN guiding principles or codes of conduct to promote human rights. So businesses should have these legal obligations, but sometimes legal obligations are not good enough. You need more than that. And I think that is where the voluntary standards become relevant in those particular situations. All right, let me take, there's a question from Dionita Putri. Question about COVID, that in the COVID pandemic, there's still a number of companies that still employ their employees to go to the office despite the government recommended that the employees must work from home. Do you think this is a violation of company human rights, violation of human rights by the company? Yes. So I think the answer is not very clear, yes or no, because in some sectors, there is no work from home. Let us say if you are working in a construction sector, how can you construct, how do you build a building or something, a road from home? You cannot do it, right? So I think we have to be realistic, but if it is possible for a particular employee to work from home, I think it could be a win-win situation, because employee would be better. There could be a better life and work balance, because the person may also talk to family members, take care of his small kids, if that is possible. It will also be good for the company, because the company may not need to rent a big office, because some employees can work from home. So their rent will be less. They may have to pay less for the furniture, less for electricity. So it may work as a win-win situation for all, not for all companies in all situations, but in some situations. So I think it's a very dynamic situation that we have to be aware of. Let me move on further. Now, in the slides that you see here, for each of the 4 steps, there are certain things, but because of lack of time, I'm not going to go through this. For instance, here you should hire experts and do consultations with the civil society actors and others. If a company can do human rights due diligence, it is not just sitting in the office and do some Google search and do the impact assessment. Rather, you need to go out. You need to talk to your employees. You need to talk to the mine workers. You need to talk to the community in the village. And when you talk to them, then you will find out how your project is causing positive as well as negative impact. Keep in mind, there is always a positive impact or a negative impact. So you need to strike a balance between positive and negative. Maximize the positive impact and minimize the negative impact. So I will skip those points because you will have all these slides later. All the slides will be emailed to you. There's a question from Soumya: how is consultation different from EIA? EIA is the environmental impact assessment, right? So we're talking about human rights due diligence. This is more holistic. It covers human rights, it covers labor rights, it covers environments, it covers gender issues, it covers everything. So environmental impact assessment focuses only on one dimension, which is the adverse impact on the environment. But when we're talking about due diligence in a more holistic concept, it covers more issues that are relevant. So I think I already explained to you some of these issues that in due diligence, you should look at the risk to the rights holders, not risk to the company. It's an ongoing process. You should also look at the risks which are not there now, but potentially in future, those risks could be there. And what steps you take will vary. So you have, let us say, a big multinational company which has 5,000 workers and it has turnover of $2 billion US. Expectations from such a company will be very different from a small tea shop. Even a small tea shop has a responsibility to respect human rights and should not hire a child to assist in the running of the tea shop business. But you don't expect the tea shop the same thing as you would expect a company. And that is what the UN guiding principles provide for this adjustment based on your size and the sector and the operating context. I think that is quite relevant. So basically, to provide a quick closing on the due diligence element, I think due diligence is absolutely critical nowadays for each and every company because that allows you to know the risk. If you know it, then you can show it how you are addressing those concerns. Then you can also manage your risk because you can avoid potential litigation because increasingly companies are facing litigation. And it is not merely litigation in your country. It is the litigation also elsewhere. Let us say the POSCO case. POSCO case, I'm sure many of you in India should know, or in South Asia should know. POSCO was a South Korean company. Vedanta is a company incorporated in the UK. Now, these are the mining operations in India, or the Kick factory example in Pakistan, or the Rana Plaza factory situation in Bangladesh. Now, these are the things happening in South Asia. But the litigation or the complaints took place in South Korea, in Germany, and in UK. And I think that is the dynamic nature companies have to understand. That will also change the law school education because we teach only the law of that particular country. But as a lawyer, that will not be enough. If you have to advise a multinational company in the future, if you merely teach them black letter law, they cannot advise their companies properly because companies have to look now in future more holistic and the international standards which are not black letter law but is still relevant. So I think that is a good space for me to go to poll 2 question. And as we go to the poll 2 question, Oxfam team, if you can flash the question, and I will pick some questions in the meantime. There's a question from Almes that is there any way to have uniform due diligence frameworks, at least regionally? The answer is both yes and no. Some organizations like OECD has issued some sector-specific guidance as well as some generic guidance. So those sector-specific guidance could be relevant. And in different regions of the world, companies can also come together and develop some standards which are going to be relevant. So those standards could be relevant, but at the same time, ultimately, it will be for each and every company to tailor make the human rights due diligence. That's why yes and no. How would HRDD make a difference to situations like Bhopal gas tragedy? That's a question from Shomya. I think the difference would be that if the Union Carbide parent company as well as the subsidiary company Union Carbide India Limited, if they had done the human rights due diligence, they would have found the risk and they would have informed their stakeholders in a much better manner. The difficulty with the Bhopal case was that no one was knowing anything in the factory what was happening. So the government in the city of Bhopal or Madhya Pradesh hardly knew anything. Or so is the poll ready or still doing poll? Let me check for a second. Okay, so I think we already have the, so let me finish this Bhopal question and then we go to the poll result. What did we get? So hardly any stakeholder, whether it's government or people living in the city of Bhopal, knew about what is the chemical composition, what is the gas, how to treat it, and what precautions to take. So they could have done much better if there was better transparency and better consultation with the stakeholders. And I think that's how due diligence could improve the situation. So I see the poll result now, and 80% of you say, 87% of you say, the participants, that the due diligence mandatory should be applicable to all companies, and 13% of you say it should apply to only big companies. So I think the idea that's a very interesting finding. So I think the idea that it should apply to all businesses is becoming increasingly relevant. At the same time, not all companies may be in a position to do this, because you need a lot of capacity, and I think that capacity may not be available immediately. And I think that is where the building of capacity over a period of time would become quite relevant. So I think let me try to open this PowerPoint again, because after the slideshow, sorry, after the poll, normally it has some difficulty. So bear with me, and hopefully it works. So can you see the slide now? Can someone put the question?
No, Surya, we can't see your slides as yet.
You can see it, right?
No, we can't.
You cannot see the slides?
No, can you share your screen once again, please?
Okay, because it says that I can share it and I'm able to share it. So I'm trying to share it again. All right.
Yes, I can see it now.
Okay, I think I have to start again. So give me a second. And let me start the slideshow. Can you see the slideshow now?
Yes. Yes.
So it seems you can see the slides now, right? I think Charu
Yes.
confirmed that. Okay, very good. So that brings me to the third pillar, access to remedy. And I know there's so many questions, but my apologies, I'm not able to deal with all the questions. But that's very good that you're able to ask those questions, and these are excellent questions. So I would encourage you to read PowerPoint once you get it after this webinar. Read the documents that you have as the resources at the end of this, and you will become more aware, and you should be able to find answer to some of your questions. Otherwise, perhaps we have to do more webinars in future, or you can email me your questions later. Let us see how we deal with that. So third pillar is access to remedy. So basically, if there are human rights abuses, then basically remedies have to be provided. And here principle 25 is quite critical, because it provides that states should take effective steps, and they should remove barriers to access to remedy. Now, when we talk about remedies, normally we talk about judicial system, the courts. But under the UN guiding principles, we are talking about three kinds of mechanisms. All right. First is state-based judicial mechanism. These are the courts. The second is a state-based non-judicial system. That is national human rights institutions. In many countries in Asia, we have a National Human Rights Commission. And increasingly, they are accepting complaints about business-related human rights abuses. The other option is, which will be discussed later on in this course, is that you can make a complaint to a national contact point established under the OECD guidelines if the company which is related to human rights abuses is a company from an OECD country. So that could be a good option. The third possibility is that the businesses should also establish a grievance mechanism, a complaint mechanism to deal with some complaints, or it could be also the system of the banks. So we have, let us say, international financial institutions, let us say World Bank is there, and they fund certain projects. So those banks also have a responsibility to provide institutions and mechanisms to provide access to remedies. There's a question coming from Voltaire. What are the prospects of an international treaty on BHR? The work is ongoing for the last 5-6 years. We do not know whether we will have this treaty or not. If you ask me personally, we need this binding instrument because that will push more and more countries to take their human rights responsibilities seriously. And unmute myself, so hopefully you can hear me again. An effective remedy. There are many elements, and you'll see a link to this slide here. You can read this report. I will not have the time to explain it, but there are many elements that make remedies effective. And some of these elements are in the subsequent slides. The first issue is that rights holders are impacted in a different way. So there are women, there are children, there are people with disabilities, there are people who are migrant workers, there are indigenous peoples, tribal people, LGBTI communities, So they are all different. And even if they're working in a particular same company, or they are affected by a project living in the same village, their human rights may be impacted differently. And the companies have to be sensitive to those differences. They have to know that how to treat children, how to treat tribal people differently. I just give you one example. If it is a normal farmer, some of the normal farmers may be able to sell their land if you give them adequate compensation. But if these are indigenous people or tribal people, they don't want to sell their land at all. For them, the land is their mother. So the question of selling your mother is not there. So the businesses have to be sensitive to this difference. So these are not normal farmers. These are indigenous people. These are tribal people. And that's why you have to respect their cultural heritage and those rights. So just to give you an example, what kind of sensitivity is needed in those particular situations. The second example of sensitivity is the gender dimension. We will discuss this in greater detail later on, where we focus on the gender dimensions. But basically, I just want to mention that sometimes you have to be sensitive to how a particular thing may impact women differently. Let us say if you have women who are pregnant, and they may have different hygiene needs, sanitation needs, and if you are in a factory, then you have to provide them special facilities. So that is crucial. Otherwise, women may not be willing to work for your company. And if they're not willing to work for a company, then we are not able to achieve gender equality. So I think those are the issues that we have to be sensitive of. Then, of course, remedy should be accessible, affordable, timely, and adequate. What are these concepts? Some of you should already know, but otherwise, I will encourage you to look at that report, which I already mentioned to you, which should be able to highlight this. The other element is that there should not be any fear of victimization. One key challenge that we face in the business and human rights field is that if you complain against a company, they fire that employee. Or if you are a trade union worker, trade union officer, they may also try to go after the trade union. And this is called victimization, intimidation of civil society actors, your employees, whistleblowers, or human rights defenders. So if you're trying to seek legitimate remedies by peaceful means, the company should value it, because it gives you an opportunity to address those concerns fast, rather than targeting those employees who are complaining about it, right? Then I think the other issue, last point for remedies, is that no single remedy could be enough. So sometimes you need compensation, but sometimes victims also want to hear a sorry, an apology which is very sincere, that we made a mistake and we will not repeat this in future. Sometimes a criminal sanction would be necessary. Sometimes you may need to provide the affected communities an alternative piece of land which is equally good. So remedies does not mean merely giving compensation. Sometimes it could mean that no project at all. you may have to stop the project, right? So a range of things have to be considered, and that is where the idea of this bouquet of remedies becomes relevant, because in this bouquet you see here there's several flowers. So it's not just one flower and one color. So all the remedies together make it effective, not merely just giving money. Now, I will finally talk about sustainable development goals and try to connect this briefly with UN guiding principles. But before I do that, let me take one or two more questions. So I see a question from Aisha. The question is, don't you think that to pressurize states to respect UNGPs is to make people aware of the concept of business human rights? Yes, so I think we need to push states, but we also need to push companies, and we also need to push everyone. All the students, teachers, investors, consumers, everyone. Everyone should become aware of these issues. And if we become more aware, so as a consumer, when I go to buy something, I should look at this issue. That instead of merely looking at the cost and I buy cheapest thing, I should also consider in what conditions those cheaper goods are made. And I think that is a big issue out of the goods coming out of sweatshops, whether they are in India, in Bangladesh, or in China. So they are very cheap goods, but how are they so cheap? Perhaps because there are labor rights violations, and that is what we need to consider, I think. All right, let me pick one more question. So this is a Facebook question from Nandita Gagoi, and effort should be made to start from somewhere. Yes, I agree. The main company should have HRDD, and then they slowly broaden it to others, and their child tie-up committee. Yes, that's a very pragmatic suggestion, that we have to start somewhere. So we can start with big companies and make it mandatory for those big companies, and then we start building capacity. And the small companies may be part of the big companies' supply chains, and that's how there could be a ripple effect as well. So if a big company is doing it, then the small companies which are part of the supply chain, they also have to take care of those particular issues. Then there is a question from Shri Manjrekar. Do right to info comes under such principles? Yes, as I mentioned previously, right to information or all human rights are included. No particular right is mentioned, but all human rights are included. Okay. So I would like to now go back. I'm conscious of the time. We have just over about 10 minutes left, and I would like to finish on time if possible. So let me go into SDGs now. So SDGs were adopted in 2015. So that is 4 years after the UN Guiding Principles. There are 17 SDGs, and these SDGs expect, of course, the governments to take number of steps to achieve these SDGs by these goals by 2030. But there is also an expectation on the part of businesses to do something. And I think there are several entry points for this. If you look at paragraph 67 of the SDG resolution, it talks about that businesses have to respect labor rights and the environment, and they make a reference to UN guiding principles. That is one opening point. The other is SDG 17. So you see SDG 17 here, it's about partnerships for the goals. And you cannot have these partnerships if the private sector is left out. So we are expecting the governments, civil society, private sector, universities, and everyone, trade unions, and all of you, universities and everyone, to come together to realize these goals. And unless we make these partnerships, it will not work. Now, what I want to highlight is that what is the correlation between the UN guiding principles and the SDGs? My example is that SDGs and UN guiding principles are two siblings born 4 years apart. And because UN guiding principles were born earlier, they could not make a reference to SDGs, of course. They did not know that SDGs will come into picture. But SDGs fully knew about UN guiding principles because they were born 4 years later. But they make only one reference to UN guiding principles in paragraph 67. And I think that reference is on the periphery in my view. It's not very deeply embedded. And that is why the UN working group, someone was asking a question, what do we do? So once there is lack of clarity on certain issues, we issue also recommendations. So the working group has issued 10 recommendations that what should governments and the private sector should do in relation to the relation of UN guiding principles and SDGs. And basically our recommendations are very simple. That first starting point for companies should be to respect all human rights. That is the starting point. Before you start to remove poverty or do something big, don't cherry pick SDGs, because there are 17 SDGs and there's a temptation for some companies and some businesses to pick 1 or 2 SDGs. That, okay, I will focus on this climate change SDG 13, or I will focus on SDG 5 on gender. But what about the other elements? That's why the starting point is that all human rights are absolutely critical. And if you respect human rights, that provides a good starting point to fulfill all SDGs. And here I would like to give you some examples. Let us say a company has to pay living wage to respect labor rights, because they have to, of course, take care of occupational safety and health as well, but they have to provide, and I'm using the word here, living, not minimum, because minimum wage in many countries could be very low. So what the expectation nowadays is that companies should pay living wage. And if you do that, it will contribute to many SDGs. And I have 3 examples on this slide. No poverty, because if you have decent salary or wage, you will not be poor as a worker. If you have enough money, you will not go hungry. And then the inequalities that we see will be less. So this is my first example. So if companies start respecting human rights, then this will definitely have an implication on SDGs. Let me take a question. There's a question coming at Facebook, I think. Shefali Agrawal has asked, how does competition law or the consumer law contribute to human rights? Very good question. So in the webinar 1, we talked about responsible business conduct as a wider concept. It covers anti-competitive behavior as well as consumer rights. And I think consumer rights are also human rights. Let us say you have right to information, right to health, right, as a consumer, right to safety, that you get safe products and services. So they can definitely contribute to promoting business respect for human rights. And that is where consumer courts can also be used for business and human rights. Anti-competitive commission can also be used to pursue human rights issues. I will take one more question. This question from Michelle Lai. What do you think the role of media should be in promoting human rights, UN guiding principles and human rights diligence at the regional, global, national level? First of all, Michelle, I think the media journalist should become aware of these standards. What I see is that media highlights the corporate abuses, but they don't make reference to these standards. So if in future media can start referring in their reports the UN guiding principles, SDGs, and other standards, I think that will be a game changer, because then consumers, readers, everyone, even companies will become aware of those standards and their relevance. So I think the media has a critical role to play, and I think that's how we should be moving. Now let me move on to the second example on this slide, where we're talking about gender equality. So gender equality is SDG 5, right? So let us say if we have a business and it stops sexual harassment, if it deals with gender pay gap issues, and it tries to fix the underrepresentation of women in positions of power, including the boards of directors of a particular company, then this business will achieve SDG 5. So you'll see there's a dynamic relationship between UN guiding principles and SDGs. By doing these things, you will achieve SDG 5. On the other hand, if you start focusing on SDG 5, it is possible you may selectively pick something and you may not respect all human rights of women. And that is where the starting point should be the human rights approach to respect all human rights, which will in turn automatically contribute to sustainable development goals. Let us take third example here. This is about labor rights. So if a business has no child labor, no forced labor, and there's no human trafficking, then it will contribute to SDG 5, which is because it will create a decent work environment and economic growth will be there. But this economic growth is very fair, inclusive, and equitable, and it's also sustainable. So I think that is what we should be asking for. Perhaps this is my last example of connecting UN guiding principles with the SDGs. Now this is about, let us say, if you are not polluting the environment, because as a company you should not pollute the environment, so you may have to do many things. Let us say you may reduce your fossil fuel. If you're using coal, you can reduce the coal's consumption. If you can turn off the lights, you can turn off air cons, you can turn off computers, you can use technologies which are less polluting, you can promote consumption of things which is more sustainable, and you can follow precautionary principle. Now, if you do all these things as a company, this will contribute to several SDGs. It will contribute to climate action as part of SDG 13. It will create clean water and better sanitation as part of SDG 7. If you take, let us say, plastic bags out of the equation, then there are no plastic bags in the ocean and the rivers. So life below water will be very, very good. And if you reduce fossil fuel, then the energy is going to be cleaner, and then it's going to create sustainable environment. So I will stop here in terms of giving examples. There are still 4 or 5 minutes left. I would like to take some more questions towards the end. There's one more example in the slides that you can see when you get the slides. There are resources at the end, so you can see these web links. So you can download these documents, freely available, and then you read these documents after you read the PowerPoints carefully, and hopefully that will give you a better starting point. And I will encourage you to read this PowerPoint tonight, so that the subsequent seminars, webinars, I should say more precisely, you are able to digest more. So Oxfam team will email you the PowerPoints tonight, both webinar 1 and webinar 2. Read the webinars, PowerPoints minimum. Later on, download these documents, and hopefully that will give you better perspective. So do solar power is best example of SDGs? Yes, Shiri is asking this question. Solar power is a good option, but again, you cannot think the solar power has no adverse impact, because how are those solar panels manufactured? Impact on birds will have to be seen. Ultimately, we also need to reduce our consumption of electricity, whether generated from coal or wind power or solar power. So a holistic approach is needed in these particular situations. There's a question on Facebook from Dimple Agrawal. Can a layman effectively raise voice against human rights violations? I think it is becoming increasingly difficult because the governments are very critical of civic space, but I think we have to try. We live in a very difficult world, Dimple, but all of us have to work together. We have to find innovative and dynamic means to raise issues about human rights anywhere in the world. And we need to create networks. We have to work together and empower each other to create this dynamic, positive situation. There's a question from Anushay Fazil. How effective can a regional convention or subsequent mandates clauses on climate environment be for the BHR? I see this as a dynamic relationship between national, regional, and international. So you need regulation at all these 3 different levels, and I would say 4th level, company level as well. So companies should have regulations for each company. The government should have regulation at the national level, and at the regional level we could have SAARC or East Asian, ASEAN countries coming together having some regulations, and then we need international regulation at the same time as well. Tapasya has a question: what type of key initiatives financial institutions can take to promote human rights? Many things are happening. So we have principles for responsible investment. So if you are an investor, you should follow those human rights before investing. If you are a financial institution giving a loan, then there are principles and standards available. So banks have a responsibility to do due diligence before giving a loan to anyone. They should not, for instance, be indulging in money laundering. They should not be funding a project which will pollute the river or environment. So I think these are the issues which are quite critical in those particular situations. So time is almost up. Let me see if I can pick one more question from someone who may have been waiting for. There are several comments sharing the PowerPoint, so don't worry, you will get the PowerPoints, and we'll also post the recording online. So, okay, so I think there are so many interesting questions, but probably I'm struggling which one to pick. So let me wind this up by thanking each one of you for all these excellent engagement. It is almost impossible for these within 90 minutes for me to share each and everything, but I hope I gave you a starting point. In the subsequent webinars, different experts will go deeper on a particular issue. So if you attend those webinars, your knowledge will deepen. If you read these PowerPoints and you read the materials that we are indicating in these PowerPoints, hopefully you will get better. And I strongly encourage you to keep BHR in mind, whatever you do, as a consumer, as a student, as a lawyer, as an academic, as a policymaker, as a civil society group, as a government official, whatever role you have in your life, personally and professionally, consider business and human rights issues, because all of us have a role to promote business respect for human rights. So with this, I would like to thank each one of you, and I also like to thank Oxfam team and pass the floor back to the Oxfam team if they want to wrap up this session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Surya. That was really wonderful hearing you about the UNGPs and how we can do a lot of linkages in terms of how we approach to the SDGs and the UNGPs in a more holistic manner, and making the human rights due diligence absolutely important. And the last point that you make was very, very key in terms of no matter what role do we play in our everyday life, we need to just be mindful of the BHR issues that come across in every aspect of our life. So I would just like to quickly wrap up and request all the participants. First of all, thank you so much for coming online and attending and joining this session, being interactive. I hope the content was extremely useful for you, and I hope that you will be joining in for the future sessions as well. Once I close this webinar, you will be receiving a feedback form which will automatically open up on your screen. I would request you to please submit your responses so that we could design our future webinars considering taking into account your feedback. Very, very useful. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. I will speak to you tomorrow then.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.